a city as famous as DC, there are a lot of rumors and a lot of myths. Some of those rumors and myths are true, but some aren't true. And that's what I want to talk about today. Let's talk about DC myths and let's debunk them. We're going to do part 1 today, and we're starting right now.
I'm Sherri Green with Coldwell Banker. Welcome to my YouTube channel that guides home sellers and home buyers in Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia.
Myth number 1, the height of buildings in D.C. was capped to prevent the overshadowing of the Capitol. Now, it's true. If you drive around D.C. or walk around D.C., you will notice the building height isn't very tall. It's not like New York or Chicago. We have a shorter, statuesque city, and it really helps with light and trees, and it makes it really interesting. But there are a lot of myths about why the buildings are the height that they are. And there's a rumor that the height of the buildings is in relationship to the height of the Capitol, that nothing can be taller than the Capitol, and that is a myth. And here's what happened. A building was built called the Cairo. It's a very famous building in DC. It is currently a residential condo building, and it is a very famous building right in the heart of DuPont Circle. When the Cairo was built, it wound up being 164 feet, and it was taller than anything in the city. And there were safety concerns that that was just too tall. You see, that building was built in 1894. So again, it was the safety concern with how tall the Cairo was. It wasn't necessarily that it was going to overshadow the Capitol. It was pretty far away from the Capitol. It was safety concern. So Congress passed the Washington, D.C. height limit in 1899. And according to the Washingtonian, the height of a building in the district is not determined in an effort to be shorter than or not to overshadow the Capitol. It is actually determined by the width of the street the building faces. So as you can imagine, wider streets, the buildings are taller. Shorter one-way streets, those buildings are shorter. Myth number 2, Pierre L'Enfant left out J Street to spite his rival, John Jay. You've probably seen in commercials or movies a J Street. There actually isn't a J Street. There's actually a company called J Street, but there is no J Street in the district. And the reason is this. The letters J and I look very similar, and especially given the time that the city was designed and planned. The scripty writing of our ancestors, those two letters looked way too similar, and they were often used interchangeably. So one had to be left out, and that was J. Myth number 3, the reason DC has traffic circles was to better stop an invading army. Now, I guess if you were to hear this, you would think, well, those circles are confusing. I got on one as a tourist and I went round and round and round and round, and you can. If you get in the wrong lane, you can seem like you're in that circle forever. But that isn't why we have circles. They were actually supposed to be squares. That's what Pierre L'Enfant envisioned, squares that were owned by each state. And then they could be inhabited by residents or congressmen of that state. Well, it turns out those squares were privately held and privately owned, and the plan just didn't come to fruition. And at the time, there were only 45 states anyway, so some of us would have been left out. So it wasn't to stop an invading army. It was simply to get around in a different direction with the city and to not infringe on these privately owned squares. Myth number 4, Washington was built on a swamp. You'll hear it a lot, got to clean the swamp. And that's really a political statement and in relationship to who's in Congress or who's in the White House. And if you've been to D.C. in the summer, it can get hot and sticky and muggy, and it can feel a little swamp-like, but so can the South. So I can see where this rumor would have stuck around and frankly been considered the truth. But here is the truth. D.C. wasn't built on a swamp, it was built on a tidal marsh. What that means is this: DC was never a wetland with trees. It was a wetland with reeds and grasses. Now this may be very particular and very specific, and it was a wet land, which sort of leads people to think swamp. But there is a scientific difference. And when you think tidal marsh, the tidal basin starts to make sense, doesn't it? Remember those cherry blossoms I talked about in a previous video? They sit along that tidal basin. We were built on a tidal marsh. Now it all starts to make sense. Are you new to my channel or you just haven't subscribed yet? Make sure you do. I post videos every week on the buying and the selling process and living in Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia, and I'd love to have you come along.